Good afternoon and welcome to Ballarat Heritage Festival, brought to you by Love Ballarat. My name's E Stewart and I'm a professional storyteller, and as is my tradition, I would like to start by acknowledging the Wathaurong people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the elders past, present, and the upcoming young people around town that are working so hard for reconciliation and to make sure that we move on together. I'd like to thank also Love Ballarat. They're a collective here in the town that are trying to support local artists. So I thank them for giving me an opportunity to come here today. Now, they've asked me to tell a couple of local stories, and I've selected one. I hope you enjoy it. People are often asking me, what are the highlights of my storytelling career? Is there anything that stands out? And because we're here in Ballarat, I want to tell you a Ballarat story. A moment where I received such accolade that I felt so enlightened and heightened about it. So let's start the story. I'm going to have to take you back to 2004. It was 150 years since the Eureka uprising, and Steve Bracks, an old mate of mine from Triple B, said we're going to have a party, and there was all sorts of things going to happen, conferences, art gallery exhibitions, and also he'd paid for a world music festival. It was called Echoes of Freedom, and people were going to come from all over the world to perform. We had Hugh Macasela, we had Yothu Yindi, everybody. It was so exciting. We heard there were hundreds of thousands of dollars going to be spent on it, and there'd be money for artists. I must say, it was so exciting, and I wondered what sort of a gig I might be able to get. But here's the rub. When they paid for all these incoming artists, they also got tents that came in from Melbourne, and all the roadies and anybody working on the project was from out of town. It seemed like there really wasn't going to be a gig for local artists like myself. But as fortune would have it, I happened to be the producer of the Saturday breakfast show at ABC Ballarat. So I was able to get the contact for the person organising this great big music festival. And I remember ringing and pestering him and kept saying, isn't there a gig for a storyteller? I've been doing this a long time and I know a lot about Ballarat. Well, finally he agreed. He'd give me a day as the MC at the World Music Concert, Echoes of Freedom. I was going to be on Saturday. So I decided that I needed to do something a little special. So I had a dress made. And I'll be able to show you that dress in a moment. I've lost me cameraman. But anyway, I got myself organised and I knew that I was going to MC it. Now, 2 days before this big world music concert, I went into the tent up at the Botanic Gardens. And when I went inside the tent, I nearly fainted. Over 4,000 people were going to be able to fit in this venue. And quite frankly, I'd never done a gig quite so big. I thought, gee, I hope I don't die of fright. This is going to be so amazing. Well, anyway, the time finally came and I'm on and I'm getting ready to be the MC. And as I mentioned, I might like to show my dress here. I've got my cameraman. So they were going to pay me $500 for 12 hours. Here it is, my Eureka dress with the 5 points of the Southern Cross. They were going to pay me $500 to come and MC for 12 hours. And I paid $500 for my dress. Well, I remember I arrived there and I went backstage and I talked to the roadies and asked them what I needed to do. And I tell you what, they were the grumpiest bunch of people that I've ever seen. And they grunted me. And I kept saying, well, how does it work? He said, here's the running sheet, take that. And I went, okay, well, I'll do my best. Now, the thing that had happened is I have a brother involved in music. He's from a band, the Painters and Dockers, but he's also from a band called the Dilly All Stars. And because world music was celebrating cultural diversity, I gave him the phone number and he got a gig for his band, the Delhi All Stars. I remember as the day rolled on, I was introducing people when at one stage this mad rock and roll star brother of mine walked past me on stage and he was wearing my favourite black sheer frilly shirt. Well, I nearly killed him. And after I saw him perform later that day, hot and sweaty, I never wore that shirt again. But it was tiring and I went on and on. Well, one of the groups I got to introduce was Yothu Yindi. And one of the most important turning points in my life was when I got a job as children's librarian in the Darwin Library. It changed my notion of Australia forever. But as it happened, during that time, I actually went out with the manager of Yothu Yindi. And here he was on stage with his band that I was able to introduce. Well, it was fantastic to have him there. But one of the highlights for seeing that performance was that Uncle Teddy Lovett's granddaughter was on stage singing. And when they'd finished, because I knew everybody there, I was able to say, thank Uncle Teddy, and what an honour it was that his granddaughter was up here with Yothu Yindi. It was fantastic. Well, another thing that really helped me with the introduction of all the events that day was that ABC had a little fund called the Regional Production Fund, and they had paid me to do 20 4-minute episodes about Eureka. So I told the story moving along. Every day they'd play it. So I had a lot of knowledge in my head about Eureka. But I think the highlight came for me when I was about to introduce Uncle Jimmy Little. You see, my niece is a Kambangari girl and her grandmother is Kambangari, Auntie Janice Brown, and she absolutely loves Jimmy Little. And there's a photo of her at her house with her arms around Jimmy. So when I knew I was going to introduce him, I was so excited. He was such a fan. All the Aboriginal crew was such a fan of Uncle Jimmy, and it was such a highlight. But as I was about to introduce him, I likened him to John Basson Humphrey, because up at the art gallery there was a wonderful exhibition, and I loved John Basson Humphrey. There was a picture of him, a Welshman, pale skin but pink cheeks, but he was a pacifist. He didn't want everybody to be fighting. He was a man for his people. And so when I was introducing Uncle Jimmy, I was weaving all these things in and how important Uncle Jimmy was and what he'd done for the Aboriginal people and how he was like J.B. Humphrey from the Goldfields. And I tied it all together and handed it over to Jimmy Little. And when I walked off stage and went backstage, the roadie that had been grunting at me all day long, he just looked at me and he said, "Nice intro." And at that moment, it felt like one of the biggest accolades in my life that this grumpy old person had given me such a promotion. But it does remind me of why we're here with Love Ballarat, because often these big things roll into town and none of the local artists get paid. So once again, I thank Love Ballarat for inviting me to come in here today. So I'm just going to have a drink of water. And so don't forget, we're happy to answer any questions. If you've got them here, just put them up on your Facebook page and we'll get back to you them. If you're interested, I've done quite a few stories that ABC funded. They're up on my website. And that's, if you Google E Stewart and Storyteller, you'll find my website and be able to find it. But I'd like to tell you now a love story from the Goldfields of Ballarat. Now, many of you might know that Ballarat is in fact a word of the Wathaurong people, and it means good place to rest. And when you drive into Ballarat from where I live in Daylesford, just as you come over Clark's Hill, two mountains sit squat on the horizon. Now, one is called Warren Heap, and according to my knowledge, it comes from an Aboriginal phrase that means covered with emu feathers. And I think that's for the ferns that grow around the base of the mountain. The other mountain, of course, is Buninyong, and that comes from an Aboriginal phrase, Bawang Yawang, meaning bent knee mountain. But I have to say, my favourite place name in all Ballarat belongs to our famous Lake Wendouree. Because according to legend, in the early days when the pastoralist William Yule arrived, he claimed all that area up near the lake as his own. For a long time, it was known as Yule's Swamp. But apparently one day, Mr. Yule was travelling the boundaries of what he called his property, and he met some of the Wathaurong people travelling through. And he walked up to them and he greeted them and said hello. And then he indicated and asked them, and what do you call this place? And they say an old woman of the tribe stood forward and said, Wendouree, Wendouree, which means get lost or go away. But I can't help but think when those early pastoralists arrived in the district and started tearing down the trees and ripping out the gold, they must have disturbed the resting Dreamtime spirits, because for all its tales of wealth, there's still many a sad story to tell about Ballarat. Now, when the cry of gold rang out in 1851, why people flocked to the district. In only a few weeks, a tent city had sprung up overnight like mushrooms after a heavy rain. Now, if you've ever been up to Sovereign Hill, which most kids in Victoria do at some stage, you'll get a good feeling for the era of when my story takes place. Now, if you were there at Sovereign Hill and standing up the top of the government camp, if you look off to the north, you would have seen the miners toing and froing in the lightly treed fields. But if you look south, you'd look down the main road back to Melbourne, past the site of the infamous Eureka Stockade. Now, there's many conjectures in Ballarat about the stockade. Some say that the poor miners just pulled it all together so they had somewhere to feel safe and rest. Others say it was the Irish, a provocative stance. They meant trouble. But whatever the truth, in the wee hours of December the 3rd, 1854, there was 150 miners up asleep at the stockade. Now, they were under the misapprehension that it was Sunday, the Lord's Day, they'd be quite safe. But under the cover of darkness, Her Majesty's Redcoats had left the government camp near the site of Ballarat Art Gallery. They'd followed the Yarrawee Creek till they came to the stockade. And then shots rang out and over 30 miners were killed. And many, many more were injured. And it is to one of these injured fellas that our story turns. His name was Joseph Patrick O'Flaherty, and he was aged 21 and formerly of County Clare in Ireland. Now, when the shots rang out, poor Joseph received a shot to his upper torso, and he was shot through the leg, and when he fell, he cut his head on the jagged mining timbers. Now, his friends could see he needed medical attention, but if they took him into the town doctor, why, they'd lock him up. So they had another idea. You see, some of the poor miners had made friends with the Chinese because they knew the Chinese were very clever and had a great understanding of healing and herbs. So they grabbed a horse, they put O'Flaherty on the back of it, and they took him up round the back of Bakery Hill. They came down to the site of the present-day railway station, but in the old days, there was a small Chinatown there. So just like Sovereign Hills, you would have seen rows of tents and communal cooking huts. Well, they went over to Chinatown and they knew the old herbalist, Mr. Jimmy Lee, quite well, so they pounded on his door. Well, Mr. Lee opened it tentatively and he saw him. Well, this was his young friend. He knew him quite well. Bring him in, bring him in. And he was laid down on a small bed in the corner of the hut. Well, Sean McDonald Joseph's partner thanked him for his help, and he gave Mr. Lee a small nugget of gold for his troubles, and off he went. So Mr. Lee set to make some broth for the young man, and he bandaged his wounds, and he gave him some broth that was full of vegetables and herbs, and perhaps in those days even a dash of opium, and he gave it to young Joseph. And after he'd had quite a few mouthfuls, he put his head back on the pillow and he fell into a fitful sleep. Now, meanwhile, at the same time, Elizabeth Ann Johnston, who was aged 19 and from Norfolk in England, was on her way to Bakery Hill. She was on her way to do the shopping for her mother, but I've got to tell you, this was the first time she'd been allowed out on the Goldfields by herself. She was the daughter of the assistant commissioner, and he had forbidden that she should go out and talk to any of those scrubby miners. But she had pestered him for so long that finally he agreed. He said, right, you can go up there to Bakery Hill, buy the things your mother needs, and then I want you straight home. But whatever you do, do not talk to any of those scrubby miners. So off she went, December morning. It was a beautiful sunny morning. She was swinging her shopping basket. She was just hoping she would catch sight of that handsome Joseph O'Flaherty. For you see, unbeknownst to her father, she had fallen madly in love with the miners. And it is said now and again they would meet in a darkened alleyway, and I hear that even a few kisses were stolen away. But as she got closer to Bakery Hill, all of a sudden she realised a sea of faces was running towards her, and they were calling out, "They've attacked the stockade! They've attacked the stockade!" Oh no, only the other day Joseph said he was going to live there. Then she heard 30 were dead. Dead. Was one of them heard Joseph? She looked around. Where was someone she could talk to? And there he was, Sean McDonald, heading round the back of Bakery Hill, Joseph's partner. She knew better to call his name. There were redcoats everywhere. So she raced as fast as she could. She grabbed him and pulled him around. Well, he knew who Elizabeth was because Joseph talked about her all day long. And he said, "Oh, ma'am, I'm so sorry. We never expected the Lord's Day they'd attack us, but your Joseph's been injured and we've taken him to Chinatown." Then he looked around and he said, "There's redcoats, I've got to get out of here." And so off he raced. Well, Elizabeth knew she should go home, but she wasn't going to go until she knew if Joseph was all right. So she went down to Chinatown. She'd been past on a drive once with her parents, and she stood there. Now, how was she going to find Mr. Jimmy Lee? But just then a little Chinese boy ran past in front of her, and she grabbed that kid and she shook him. And she said, "Do you know Mr. Lee? Tell me, where's..." And he pointed at one of the huts. Well, she ran over and pounded on the door. Now, Mr. Lee feared redcoats, so he just opened the door a little. But by now, Joseph was up on his elbows, and when he saw Elizabeth's flaming red hair, he went, "Oh, Beth." Well, Mr. Lee realised the connection. He let the young girl in, and she ran over and knelt beside him and held his hand and said, "Oh, Joseph, this is terrible." And by then, Mr. Lee had arrived with a little bowl of broth and indicated that he should try and eat some more. So Elizabeth gave him a few mouthfuls. And then Joseph asked, "What news of the stockade? What's happening?" "Oh, it's terrible. Over 30 are dead. They've imposed martial law. They're looking for you all. They're going to lock you all up." But by now, they were holding hands and both drifting in and out of a fitful sleep. Now, a little bit later, there was a secret rap at the door. It seemed that Mr. Lee knew who it was. And straight away, when he opened it, it was the little Chinese boy, in fact, his grandson. He came into the room and he pulled something from under his jumper. "For Mr. Joseph, for Mr. Joseph." It was a letter from Sean. And Elizabeth opened it for him and read and said, "The redcoats are on their way to Chinatown. Get out now." Well, there was nothing else they could do. They would have to make good their escape. So Mr. Lee went over and he talked to his young grandson. And he gave him instructions, and he came back to Elizabeth and Joseph. And he said, now you go with my grandson and he will take you to the tunnel. You must go and wait till nightfall. And then under the cover of darkness, you must escape to Warren Heath and the forest in safety. You see, unbeknownst to the government forces, because the Chinese had been so badly persecuted on the Goldfields, because they were so canny and clever, they built a tunnel underneath, or where the old railway line is now. And many a canny Chinaman had spent days up there escaping persecution. Well, they wandered off. Joseph had his arm around Elizabeth. They had a basket of provisions, and together they followed the small boy. Well, he walked for what seemed like an eternity. Come, come, until finally he said, stop. He pulled back some native trailing ivy. He wound back some old cartwheels and moved the mining timber. He said, here, now, you wait. And so together Elizabeth and Joseph headed up the tunnel, and there they sat down till nightfall, when they could make good their escape. Well, hours later, they woke up. It was pitch black inside the tunnel, and they were both dazed and confused. And the opium was playing tricks on Joseph's mind. So instead of heading off to Warren Heath and the forest in safety, they stumbled, tripped and headed down back towards Ballarat. And when they came out the end of the tunnel, the sky was a blood red colour, and silhouetted against it was Assistant Commissioner Johnston and one of Her Majesty's redcoats. They say Commissioner cried out, "O'Flaherty, you surrender!" Well, they say that O'Flaherty lunged forward to grab the Commissioner, and some say he just fell in pain, but in the next moment, when Elizabeth stooped down to catch him, the fatal shot rang out, and it was Elizabeth that got the bullet straight through the heart, and Elizabeth that fell down dead, her head cradled in the arms of her love. Well, they took O'Flaherty off, and he died the very next day, broken in heart, broken in spirit, broken in body. And even though tragically they both died and are gone, they are not forgotten. For it is said in Ballarat, if you're ever near the old railway tunnel and the sky is a blood red colour, you might see that ghostly couple trying to make good their escape one last time. Thank you everybody for listening, and we have a question from Shannon. Can you share any more information about the relationships between European and Chinese miners in Ballarat? I'm not so good on that information. I know you've got a lot of crew here that would be good, but I tell you what, Culture Victoria has quite a few things on their website. So if you go and have a look there, they've got so many fabulous things. And I do believe they did that big exhibition up at the Gold Museum, so I'd be heading up that way if I was you, Shannon, to see what I could find out. And thank you so much, everybody listening. If you want to hear any more stories about Ballarat, go to my website, www.annestewart.com.au. Thanks, love Ballarat. As I said, I have got some stories that you can listen to. Ballarat's been ABC's been a great supporter of mine. You can do a literary walk around town and follow all the different references to literature in our little hometown. So many fabulous people came. I believe Mark Twain came here to this very Mechanics Institute. Trollope, now what was his name? John? He's been here as well. But once again, thank you, love. Actually, wrong one, that's a movie. Love Ballarat. So many fabulous people came. I believe Mark Twain came here to this very